The old house stood at the end of Harbinger Lane. Dark and brooding, it had been empty for as long as anyone could remember. Kids in town whispered about the ghost of Old Man Withers, who had died in the house many years ago. They said his ghost still haunted the place, searching for something he'd lost. No one dared to go near the house. Its paint was peeling, and the windows were boarded up like the eyes of a monster. The yard was overgrown with weeds, and gnarled branches scraped against the house like skeletal fingers. It was a place of secrets, a place where shadows danced and the air was heavy with the weight of forgotten things. For years, the house stood as a silent sentinel, a grim reminder of the past. But that was all about to change, because one day, a moving van rumbled down Harbinger Lane, kicking up dust and shattering the silence that had settled over the abandoned house for so long. The arrival of the moving van sent ripples of unease through the town. People whispered about who would dare to live in the house on Harbinger Lane. Some said it was a family from out of state, people who didn't know about the house's dark history. Others weren't so sure. They said that whatever had drawn the new residents to the house was something sinister, something that sent chills down their spines. As the movers unloaded furniture and boxes, strange noises began to emanate from the house. At night, flickering lights were seen in the windows, and eerie music seemed to drift from the attic. The townsfolk avoided the house even more now, their whispers turning into hushed pronouncements that something was wrong, terribly wrong. The old house, once shrouded in silence, was now alive with unsettling activity. The ghost of Old Man Withers seemed to have awakened. His mournful cries carried on the wind. Or perhaps it was something else, something far more sinister that had taken up residence within the crumbling walls of the old house. Billy Evans, a lanky 15-year-old with a mop of brown hair and a thirst for adventure, watched the house from his bedroom window across the street. Billy didn't believe in ghosts, but there was something about the house that sent a shiver down his spine. Maybe it was the way the shadows seemed to cling to it, or the way the wind howled through the broken panes of glass, sounding like mournful cries. Billy had lived on Harbinger Lane his entire life, and he had grown up with the stories about the old house. He had always been curious about it, but even he knew better than to venture too close. Now, with the arrival of the new neighbor, his curiosity was piqued. He was determined to find out who had moved into the house and what secrets they were hiding. One afternoon, while the late summer sun cast long shadows across the lawn, Billy saw someone moving about in the overgrown garden of the old house. It was a man, tall and thin, with stooped shoulders and long, bony fingers that clutched a trowel. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face, but even from a distance Billy could tell that the man was old, his skin pale and wrinkled like ancient parchment. Billy told his friends about the old man, describing his hunched figure and the way he moved with an uncanny stillness. His friends were skeptical, but Billy's description of the strange lights and noises he'd seen and heard at night piqued their interest. Soon, the rumors about the new resident of the old house were spreading like wildfire through the town. One night, as Billy and his friends gathered in their usual spot behind the bleachers at the schoolyard, the conversation inevitably turned to the mysterious neighbor. One of Billy's friends, a swaggering boy named Tommy, dared him to go to the house and see if the rumors were true. "I dare you, Billy," Tommy said, his voice a taunting whisper. "Go up to the house and knock on the door. Ask the old man if he believes in ghosts." Billy's heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't sure if he wanted to do it, but he couldn't back down from a dare, especially not in front of his friends. With a deep breath, Billy agreed. He would go to the house, and he would ask the old man about the ghosts. That night, under the pale glow of a crescent moon, Billy crept toward the old house. His heart hammered against his ribs and his breath formed frosty clouds in the chilly air. As he approached the house, he could hear the sound of music coming from inside, a haunting melody that seemed to seep out from the very walls. Billy reached the front porch and hesitated. The wood beneath his feet was rotten and creaked ominously under his weight. He raised his hand to knock on the door, but then he heard a noise from inside the house. It was a soft thud, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. Billy's curiosity outweighed his fear. He slowly pushed open the front door, which creaked loudly on its hinges. The air inside the house was thick with dust and the scent of mildew. Cobwebs hung from every corner, and shadows danced in the dim light filtering in from the streetlights outside. Taking a deep breath, Billy stepped inside. The floorboards groaned under his weight as he made his way down the long, dark hallway. Each step sent shivers down his spine, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The music grew louder as Billy climbed the stairs. It was coming from the attic. He reached the top of the stairs and stood before a heavy wooden door. The music was almost deafening now, a cacophony of strings and piano keys that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards. Billy reached out and gripped the doorknob. It was cold and damp in his hand, as if it had been submerged in ice water. He hesitated for a moment, listening to the music and the strange rustling sounds coming from behind the door. Then, with a deep breath, he turned the knob and pushed the door open. The attic was dimly lit by a single bare bulb hanging precariously from the ceiling. Dust motes danced in the weak light, and the air was heavy with the smell of decay. In the center of the room, surrounded by stacks of old books, furniture draped in white sheets and cobweb-covered paintings, stood a gramophone. Its brass horn gleamed in the dim light as it played the haunting melody. As Billy took a step closer, the music stopped abruptly. The gramophone needle scratched across the record, creating a high-pitched whine that echoed through the silent attic. Billy froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He was sure he had heard something else, a soft whisper that seemed to come from the shadows in the corner of the room. Billy's eyes slowly adjusted to the dimness of the attic. He could make out the shapes of old furniture draped in white sheets, stacks of dusty books and cobweb-covered paintings lining the walls. And then he saw it, a faint glimmer of light coming from behind a tall, ornately carved grandfather clock that stood against the far wall. Cautiously, Billy approached the grandfather clock, his heart pounding in his chest. The air seemed to grow colder as he neared the clock, and he could feel a strange, tingling sensation on the back of his neck. He reached out and slowly pushed the heavy clock to the side. Behind the clock was a small door, barely noticeable against the dark wood paneling. The faint light was coming from the gap beneath the door. Billy knelt down and pressed his ear against the cold wood. He could hear voices, whispers so low that he could barely make them out. They seemed to be coming from behind the door, from a secret room hidden within the attic. Curiosity gnawed at Billy's insides. He had to know what was behind the door, what secrets the old house was hiding. With trembling hands, he reached for the doorknob. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. Billy hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the wrought iron railing. The whispers had stopped, but the strange tingling sensation on the back of his neck intensified. He took a deep breath and started down the stairs. The air grew heavy and oppressive as Billy descended. The steps were narrow and steep, and he had to duck his head to avoid hitting the low ceiling. After what felt like an eternity, the stairs ended at another door. This one was smaller and made of metal. Billy pressed his ear against the cold metal. He could hear voices again, this time clearer, speaking in hushed tones. He couldn't make out the words, but the voices sent chills down his spine. One was high-pitched and reedy, while the other was deep and guttural, sending vibrations through the metal door. Billy's hand trembled as he reached for the doorknob. He knew he should turn back, but his curiosity was too strong to resist. He had to know the secret of the silent neighbor. The door swung open with a groan, revealing a small, dimly lit room. In the center of the room, two figures were hunched over a table, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of a single candle. Billy's blood ran cold. The figures were the old man he had seen in the garden, and a young girl, no older than himself, with long, flowing black hair and piercing blue eyes. The girl was bound and gagged, her eyes wide with terror. The old man had his back to Billy, seemingly unaware of his presence. He was chanting in a low voice, his bony fingers tracing strange symbols in the air above the girl's head. As Billy watched in horror, the old man produced a wicked-looking knife from his robes. He raised it high above his head, the candlelight glinting off the blade. Billy knew he had to act fast. "Hey!" Billy shouted, his voice echoing through the small room. The old man whirled around, his eyes blazing with fury. The knife clattered to the floor and the girl whimpered in fear. The old man's face contorted in rage and he lunged for Billy. Billy stumbled backward, tripping over a loose floorboard and falling to the ground. The old man was on top of him in an instant, his long, bony fingers reaching for his throat. Billy thrashed and kicked, but the old man was too strong. Suddenly, the girl, who had managed to free herself from her bonds, grabbed the fallen knife from the floor. She plunged it into the old man's back with a scream of fury. The old man roared in pain and collapsed on top of Billy. Billy pushed the old man's lifeless body off of him and scrambled to his feet. He looked at the girl who was standing over the old man's body, her eyes wide with shock and fear. "We have to get out of here," Billy shouted, pulling the girl towards the stairs. They raced up the stairs and through the attic, the sounds of the old man's dying groans echoing behind them. Billy threw open the attic door and practically dragged the girl down the stairs and out of the house. Billy and the girl didn't stop running until they reached the safety of Billy's house. They collapsed on the porch steps, gasping for breath. Billy looked back at the old house, his heart pounding in his chest. The windows were dark and the only sound was the wind whistling through the trees. Billy never went back to the house on Harbinger Lane. The old man and the girl were never seen again. Some people said they disappeared, vanishing without a trace. Others whispered that their ghosts now haunted the house, their cries echoing through the empty rooms. As for Billy, he never forgot the horrors he witnessed that night. He knew deep down that the house on Harbinger Lane held many more secrets, dark and terrible secrets that would never see the light of day. And he knew that the haunting was far from over.